So what if the story most of us have heard about medieval Indian history is missing a massive piece of the puzzle? Today we're diving into a book that completely challenges the narrative of easy conquests. Instead, it argues that for centuries there was fierce, heroic, and sustained resistance. Let's get into it.
The book we're unpacking in this explainer is Sita Goel's Heroic Hindu Resistance to Muslim Invaders. Our goal is pretty straightforward. We're going to explore its central argument and look at the evidence the author presents to challenge the conventional story of this nearly 600-year period. The author kicks things off by looking at this famous poem by Matthew Arnold. Now, he argues that what was meant to be a tribute to Hindu spirituality got twisted by some historians. It was used to paint this picture of a meek Hindu, someone who was, more interested in philosophical ideas than in actually defending their homeland. And this, he says, became a foundational myth.
And that leads us right to the book's core argument, that the common narrative is what the author calls a perverse version of history, a version that's so focused on the final result that it just completely skips over the centuries of struggle that came before. This slide really lays out the two different ways of looking at this. On one side, you have the standard history, which often portrays India as this sort of passive land, an easy prize for one invader after another. But the book argues for what it calls a national perspective, which totally reframes the story. It sees India as an ancient homeland that was actively and heroically defended for centuries. So, what's the first piece of evidence the book brings to the table? Well, it starts right at the beginning with the earliest Arab invasions in the 7th century. Okay, so get this. The author makes a really striking comparison. He points out that the huge Sassanid Empire in Persia, it fell in about a decade. Syria, Egypt, North Africa, all conquered within a few decades. And those armies crossed into Spain by 709 AD. But when those same armies turned their attention to India, they ran into something completely different. This timeline really puts it all into perspective. The very first naval raids in 636 AD were beaten back. It took until 712, almost 80 years later, for a foothold to even be gained in Sindh. And even then, by 738, Indian kingdoms were already pushing them back. The book's key point here, after nearly 300 years, the Arab presence was basically stuck in just two small city-states.
And we know about all these conflicts from local sources too. Indian inscriptions from that time, like the Navasari inscription, they talk about these invaders, calling them Tajikas, and they record the victories of local rulers against them. It gives us a whole other perspective that's often missing if you only read the invaders' accounts. Now here's a fascinating little detail the author uses to show just how shaky the invaders' position was. In the city of Multan, the Arab rulers apparently couldn't defend the city with military strength alone. So what did they do? They basically held a revered Hindu idol hostage. Whenever Hindu kings would attack, they'd threaten to smash the idol, which would force a retreat. For the author, this isn't a sign of strength. It's a sign of a power so fragile it had to rely on a religious threat to survive.
Okay, so how did this story of resistance continue with the next wave of invaders? The book then turns to the Ghaznavids, and specifically the very famous Mahmud of Ghazni.
The standard story we hear about Mahmud is one of, 17 successful raids, just plundering temples and cities whenever he wanted? The author here says, no way, that's a myth. He reframes Mahmud's campaigns not as these easy victories, but as a story of frustrated ambition. He argues every single raid was met with stiff resistance that, in the end, kept him from building any kind of lasting empire beyond the Punjab.
The book uses the Shahaya dynasty as a prime example. This was a struggle that went on for almost 50 years across 3 generations. First, you have Jayapala, who chose self-immolation over the dishonor of defeat. Then his son, Anandpala, who actually managed to rally a confederacy of princes to fight back. And finally, his grandson, Trilochinapala, who fought so hard that even after a victory, a chronicler wrote that Mahmud couldn't rest easy because he feared his opponent's superhuman prowess.
This quote, which the book says came from a message from Jayapala, is presented as the very spirit of this resistance. It's this declaration that honor was literally worth dying for. A mindset the author argues was absolutely central to the fight.
And hey, the resistance wasn't just coming from the Shayas. The book tells this incredible story about when Mahmud marched against the Chandela king, Vijayadhara. When he saw the sheer size of the Hindu army waiting for him, the invader's own historian wrote that Muhammad repented of his coming. The whole campaign just fizzled out into a stalemate, with an exchange of compliments instead of a battle.
That is a far cry from the image of some unstoppable conqueror, right? So, the book makes a strong case that it wasn't a lack of courage. Then what was it? What finally led to the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate in the late 12th century? Well, the author points to a big change in the invaders' tactics.
The analysis here is that the next major invader, Muhammad Ghori, he learned from the Ghaznavids' failures. He figured out that brute force just wasn't going to cut it. His success, the author claims, came from stratagems, which is a polite word for what the book just calls plain old treachery or perfidy.
And the two battles of Tarian are presented as the ultimate proof of this. In the first battle, Prithvi Raja Chauhan's army absolutely crushes Ghori's forces. But, following a code of honor, they let the defeated army just retreat. The author calls this sense of generosity completely unsuitable against a ruthless enemy. And you can see why. A year later, Ghori comes back, and this time, according to the book, he pretends he wants a truce, lulling the Rajput army into a false sense of security before launching a devastating surprise attack at dawn.
All right, so let's wrap all this up with the book's final analysis. What are the big lessons the author thinks should be learned from this long history of conflict?
So, according to the author, the problem was never a lack of bravery. It was a combination of strategic and cultural factors. He points to a few things: a failure to have a forward policy to go after the invaders' home bases, armies that weren't unified, and the enemy's better cavalry and mounted archers. But the most critical factor, he argues, was a code of chivalry that treated war like a sport with rules, which was just no match for an enemy waging total war. And finally, this vulnerability where peaceful merchants and mystics were allowed to settle, who were then feeding intelligence back to the invaders.
And this brings us to the author's final powerful point. From that first raid being pushed back in 636 AD, all the way to the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate in 1206 AD, the struggle lasted 570 years. The book's central message is really simple. This was not a quick collapse. This was one of the longest, most determined defensive wars in all of world history.
And that leaves us with a final question to think about. This book makes a powerful case for looking at a period of history from a totally different perspective. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How much do these foundational stories we tell ourselves, whether they're stories of easy conquest or stories of heroic resistance, truly shape a nation's understanding of itself, both right now and for the future?